Thank you very much. You're wonderful. I'm Ruth Dyer. I'm the Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs here at Kansas State University. And I'm absolutely delighted that you have joined us for this evening's event. This is the 39th event in this particular lecture series. And isn't it a wonderful day to be in Kansas? I had the opportunity to actually go outside my office a few times today, and I enjoyed every single moment of it. And I think that we should assure our speaker tonight, Dr. Zellner, that this is a typical day in Kansas in March. The Office of the Provost established this Civil Rights Lecture Series in 1994 in recognition of Dorothy L. Thompson's contributions to the field of human rights on campuses throughout Kansas and the nation. Ms. Thompson was the director of the Office of Affirmative Action from 1972 until 1985. At that time, she became the Associate University Attorney and served in that office until her untimely death in 1992. Dorothy was a role model for women and attorneys across the state of Kansas, and she was highly regarded by persons of all political leanings for her diplomacy, judiciousness, and effectiveness. She had an abiding respect for all people and a profound commitment to fairness and equity. The Civil Rights Lecture Series is a particularly fitting memorial for her. The selection of speakers and organization of the Dorothy L. Thompson Civil Rights Lecture Series is carried out by a committee that works to bring these programs to our campus. At this point in time, I would like all of the committee members who are here to please stand, and let's join me in thanking them for their very hard work. I also want to recognize the patrons of the lecture series, as it is their continuing interest and financial support that allow the series to bring such outstanding speakers as Dr. Zellner to our campus. In particular, I would like to recognize Dr. Chuck Thompson, who was Dorothy's spouse and who is a former head of the K-State Psychology Department and a founding contributor to the lecture series, and his wife, Carolyn, a former member of our architecture faculty. Chuck, would you please stand? And I would also like to ask all of the patrons who are present to stand. And again, please join me in thanking them for their wonderful contributions in helping us enjoy this event this evening. So patrons, please stand. At this point, I'd like to turn our program over to Dr. Brent Manor, who is the chair of the organizing committee. And Dr. Manor is going to serve as our MC for the rest of the program. And thank you very much.
So good evening and welcome. I'd also like to thank the Office of the President, Office of the Provost, who have also generously supported our lecture series over the years and the most recent years especially. Each year at Christmas time, I give myself a present, and because I'm a historian, 9 out of 10 times it's a book. This past Christmas, the gift I gave myself was Mr. Zellner's autobiography, because I knew he was coming this spring. And so I read it over the semester break, and it was just a wonderful and refreshing read, not only because of the American history that I learned and that it covered, but also because of this process of personal discovery that we see in his work and in his career. One of the things that's crystal clear is that Mr. Zellner's conversion to the freedom movement or to the idea of freedom didn't come out of some complex theoretical set of considerations or musings. Rather, it was the recognition in the society that he lived in that certain things were wrong and that things were not as they should be. And it's this idea of recognizing this and then acting upon it with a commitment and a courage that's just unmatchable, I think, that just really made this an inspiring book for me. So I'm so excited to have him here tonight as our guest as we think about not only the history of the civil rights movement and his participation in it, but also in a call to action today to also think about changes, social change today, and the ways that we can commit ourselves to making our country, our world better. It's with great pleasure then that I welcome to the podium Mr. Bob Zellner.
Thank you.
Would you prefer this one?
Oh, let's see. Well, I'll use this one for a while if I need to clip that one on. I'm going to walk around later on. I'm going to be as informal as possible, and thank you all for coming down front so that we can commune together. Thank you, Brent, for that introduction. One of the best that I've had. It's very short, so it leaves me something to say. My name is Bob Zellner, and I'm from L.A., Lower Alabama. The students are tired of that joke already, but thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Dorothy L. Thompson, for having looked down from above and thought that it might be a good idea for us to commune together tonight. I was very blessed to be raised in Lower Alabama, and my raising was not very typical of Americans, but it was sadly typical of Southerners. My father was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. My grandfather was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of my family were involved in the Ku Klux Klan. My mother and father were both graduates of Bob Jones College, which became Bob Jones University. Not a hotbed of Southern progressivism. So with that background of Christian fundamentalism and the Klan, you might say I descend from a long line of fundamentalist terrorists. I think that's interesting because today we're still faced with the question of fundamentalism and terrorism around the world. And I've done a study of that, and as I hope many of you will. And one of the aspects of fundamentalism is that it says that those who are in the group, I will protect you, I will honor you, I will cherish you. If you're outside the group, I have the right to harm you. I may even have the obligation to harm you. Well, to me, that is not the American way. So as I grew up, I was very lucky that my father broke with the Ku Klux Klan. And when my father broke with the Ku Klux Klan, his father disowned him, disinherited my father, and his brothers never spoke to him again in this life. That was the seriousness of the situation that I grew up in Lower Alabama under a system of apartheid in the United States. My state of Alabama was a police state. So it was very unlikely that a little white boy from the wrong side of Murder Creek, the reason I call my book The Wrong Side of Murder Creek is that I did a lot of my growing up in East Bruton, Alabama, which was across Murder Creek from Bruton, Alabama. That creek separated the classes and to a large extent the races in my little town. And when I grew up, Bruton, Alabama was the richest town in the United States, richer than Darien, Connecticut, richer than Topeka, Kansas. Is Topeka rich? I'm not sure. So I faced my whole life as a little boy, people looking at me and saying, boy, you're on the wrong side of Murder Creek, which was supposed to mean that I would never amount to anything, that my life is laid out for me by the circumstances of my birth to a poor Methodist minister and a school teacher with 4 brothers. But we were able to overcome that by stepping out of our comfort zone, by stepping over the rules and regulations of apartheid and opposing the police state. Many of you may be required to do that in your lifetime. We'll talk about a lot of things tonight. I'm going to make a short speech tonight because I've had such good time talking to the students here. The class that I addressed this morning was an amazing class, and maybe because they knew a lot about the civil rights movement and had read my book, at least a part of it. Finished reading that book, by the way. It's very easy when I talk to people who know a great deal about the struggle of women, the struggle of labor unions, the struggle of minorities, the struggles of immigrants in this country. We are a country of immigrants. I now live in Southampton, New York. So in a sense, I moved from down south to up south. The reason I say that is when I was teaching at the university, Long Island University in Southampton, I became a member of the Southampton Anti-Bias Task Force. And in 2001, I was called to the reservation of the Shinnecock Nation in Southampton because a housing development next to the reservation was bulldozing the cemetery, the ancient burial ground of the Shinnecock community. And they were, of course, as upset as you would be if bulldozers were plowing up your grandmother and your grandfather and so forth. So I was called to that scene to try to mediate between the Shinnecocks and the state police. And as we were talking, they slowly began to identify me, even though I've said I'm from the town. I was appointed the head of the Anti-Bias Task Force by the town of Southampton. So in a sense, I was in official capacity. And I was doing my best to be on even terms between the police and the community. A temporary restraining order had already been gotten against the bulldozing of the cemetery. And I asked the police, the state police, and they said, yes, we know, but it hasn't gotten here yet. And they want to tear up as much of this as they can before it gets here. And that's what they're going to do. As I talked to the major in charge, 4 policemen, and all of you who have the book, you can look at the picture section in the center, and you'll see a picture of me as a 62-year-old person being grabbed from behind by 4 or 5 state troopers. They broke this arm and this elbow, knocked my jaw out of place, knocked my left knee out of joint, and threw me in jail for the night with the Native Americans from the reservation who had also been arrested. And I felt then that I was right at home, because as I was in the civil rights movement in the South, I was arrested 18 times. I was beaten on numerous occasions, and so as I was being beaten by the state police in New York, I said, police are the same all over. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm anti-police. It means that I have a certain experience that teaches me something. And I want to tell you one little story about how I got out of the Christian fundamentalism and the terrorism of my ancestors. I was very lucky to go to school in Montgomery, Alabama. In Montgomery, Alabama, I had graduated high school in Mobile, and I was in Montgomery from 1957 to 1961 in our church school, Huntington College, a Methodist school. Well, my senior year, in a sociology class, I was assigned a paper to write a paper about the racial situation and write about solutions to the racial problem. So myself and 4 other students told our professor we wanted to go speak to Martin Luther King, and we wanted to talk to Rosa Parks. And our professor said, you can't do that. And we said, why? He said, you'll be arrested. Well, being young sociologists, our imagination, our sociological imagination was piqued by the idea that you could be arrested doing research for a paper. So, being young and brash, 5 of us went anyway. We talked to Dr. King in the federal court building. In those days, if you wanted to find Dr. King, go to court, and he was usually there. That was neutral territory, so you could talk without breaking the segregation laws. And he said, yes, you can come. We're having a meeting at Reverend Abernathy's church. I'm going to speak, and there's going to be some students there from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We'll be doing a nonviolent workshop. So we thought that would be a great way to get material for our paper. And we said, we'd like to come. And he said, you're welcome to come, but you may be arrested. Now, once again, we were a little bit taken aback, and we said, that's what our professor said. And he said, that's why he's a professor. He's pretty smart about those things. Of course, you can get arrested in 1959 in Montgomery if you break the segregation laws. Well, we said, we have a right to do that. We know about the First Amendment. We weren't law students or pre-law, but we knew about the First Amendment. We knew we had a right to do that. We knew that our own church, the Methodist Church, had indicated that as young people and as interested Christians, we should reach across barriers. So we decided to go. Sure enough, at the end of the meeting, Dr. King came over, and this was before Dr. King was St. Martin Luther King. And a twinkle in his eye and a smile, I thought he was really smiling, said, the five of you, the police have surrounded the church, and they've said the five of you are going to be arrested. And I said, Dr. King, we need to escape. So he said, well, you remember that little workshop we had about you might be arrested? And I said, well, what we really mean is that we need to try to escape. We don't want to get our parents in trouble. We don't want to get our school in trouble. And he said, I see what you mean. He said, I tell you what I'll do. I'll go out the front, so if all the police and the news people run around there, Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Parks can take you to the basement, and you can run for it. There's a back door. So sure enough, as Dr. King prepared to go out the front, we were waiting for Reverend Abernathy to open the door. Mrs. Parks, that quiet woman of granite, she was not yet Saint Rosa Parks, but she would become, and it was clear at that point that she was going to be a secular saint of the United States. Mrs. Parks put her hand on my left elbow. I've never washed that elbow since then. And she said, Bob, when you see something wrong, you're going to have to take some action. You're going to have to do something. You can't study this forever. Now, has anyone ever had a more direct commission from headquarters to get into the movement than that? So the end of the story, of course, is that Dr. King went out the front. The police did run around there. Reverend Abernathy opened the door. And the funniest thing you've ever seen is 5 little white boys running all out through the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, trying to get away from our own police. We had suddenly gone from being one of the most privileged group of people in history of human beings. We were white, we were Southern, we were young, we were male, and we were in a, more or less fancy upgrade private school. With one act, going to church, we had now become outlaws. And our president of our college went on the newspaper and said, these students are not representative of Huntington College. They're hoodlums, they're troublemakers. And then the very next day after that, 2 of the 5 students, and usually you'll find this, by the way, all of the students here, people who get involved in risky behavior, which becomes historical later on, if you take a risk, if you do what Dr. King said, if you have something worth dying for, you're worth living. Dr. King said, if you don't have something that's worth dying for, you're probably not fit to live. So you can find what happens is that people who take action, and we certainly have got a lot of action that needs taking today, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Those are usually the most intelligent folks around. So 2 of us had been given the college's highest honor. The same president now is putting this stole around us, saying you've reached the highest academic level, the true scholarship, true intellect, following truth wherever it may lead. Now, all of this is just cant, right? This is in the book. He reads that every year since 1853. Not the same president. I think he lasted about half that time. But now, all of a sudden, we, who had gotten the college's highest honor, are also troublemakers, hoodlums, and so forth. So as a result, he said, you have to leave school. The president of our college said, you have to resign from school. You've embarrassed the school. You've broken the segregation law. The Klan burnt crosses around our dormitory. There was a Klan rally right down the campus right down the street from the campus, and the Klan burned a 38-foot cross and said, we're going to get the students at Huntington. who were trying to integrate Montgomery, Alabama. Then we were called into the office of the Attorney General. We're just little college students. And what did we do? We went to church. And now we'd been asked to leave school. The Klan is burning crosses around the dormitory, and we're called in to explain ourselves to the Attorney General of the state, who says, "You have fallen under the communist influence." And I said, "You mean there's communists in Alabama?" And he said, "No, but they come through here." Now, for the young people, you see, we were in the middle of the Cold War, right? We were in a constant struggle with the godless Russians, with the Soviet Union. Our country represented freedom, democracy, equality, fraternity, justice. And all of a sudden, you can get asked to leave school and you can be called a communist because you went to church and heard Dr. Martin Luther King preach and saw some students from SNCC give a nonviolent workshop. We weren't arming ourselves. We weren't going out on the warpath. That's what we were doing. So I learned more when I broke out of school than I was learning in school. So you may do that too. You may find that there are issues on campus that need discussing, and that people might need to take a risk. We had great examples in the South of black African-American school teachers at all levels in the South who took risks, who risked their good jobs to participate in the movement. And what happened is when they would go on a picket line or they would go on a march, it meant their job most of the time. So that's what we were faced with then. I'm going to make it, I'm going to kind of shorten it here and tell you that when I did graduate, I went to Highlander Folk School for my first teaching job. Highlander Folk School was a school in Tennessee, one of the few places in the South where black and white people could meet together. And when I grew up in Alabama, there were big billboards with pictures of Martin Luther King, and it says, "Martin Luther King at Communist Training School." So this same Attorney General and everybody said, if you get involved in women's issues or try to organize a union or want to do something about segregation, you are under alien influence. And what happens today? Is it right here in Manhattan, Kansas, where you have a billboard now about President Obama? Everybody that knows about the billboard over by Fort Riley, have you heard about that? History repeats itself. It's over 50 years since we were asked to leave school in Montgomery because we went to an integrated meeting. Do you know that if this meeting right here was suddenly transported to Montgomery, 1959, every single person in this auditorium could be arrested and have a criminal record because you are breaking the law. In Montgomery, Alabama, it was against the law for black and white people to sit down together. You could stand up together all you wanted to. You could ride an elevator. Once they won the Montgomery bus boycott, you could ride on a bus, a city bus. But when the Freedom Riders came to Montgomery, they were massacred by the Ku Klux Klan because they wanted to ride interstate buses, black and white together. You remember I mentioned the Cold War? Those buses that were burned when they got to my state of Alabama were on the front pages of every newspaper in the world, in China, in Russia, everywhere around the world, because Americans were trying to kill other Americans because those Americans wanted to do what? Ride integrated on an interstate bus. That's what growing up 50 years ago was. Now you have a situation where you still have billboards. And you know, Europeans chuckle when Americans with a straight face say that our President Obama is a socialist. They chuckle. Our president is not a socialist. Our president is really right down the line. And many of his supporters wish he was more socialist than he is. Not very socialist at all, you know? And so when we call him a socialist, what are we really saying? It's the same thing as when they said we were communists because we wanted to do something about segregation. Exactly the same sentiment. Also on this campus, I understand there's controversy about international students. When there's controversy about international students on a campus today, I know that we had the same thing 50 years ago. And I know as an undergraduate at Huntington College, I learned more from the Iranians and the Iraqis and the Saudis and the Africans and so forth. You know that an African could go to my school, but not an African American? I mean, that was amazing that we had such a cockamamie. I think that's a Yiddish word, but anyway, it's a New York word, and I'm in Manhattan, so I can use that, right? We had a cockamamie idea about race in this country. And I always wondered how they tried to enforce segregation in a place like New Orleans, Louisiana. How in the world do you tell who is black and who is white and who is Cajun and who is this, that, and the other in New Orleans, Louisiana? Well, it was always a problem because race was a social construct rather than anything else. And it still is. And what we're faced with now in this Dorothy L. Thompson lecture series is that we're looking at those questions and how they affect our country. If I don't say one thing tonight that sticks with you, let me say this. Freedom is a constant struggle. We thought that we had settled some women's questions in 1920 when women got the vote. You know, it was less than 100 years ago that women in this country were first allowed to vote. Women now are the largest voting group in the United States. So, in the 50s and the 60s, during the movement, we settled a lot of other questions about women, contraception, abortion, all of those things. Those things became ironclad rights that people had. The privacy of the bedroom. No government interference in our bedroom. And now the same people who preach no interference and no government in your life now wants them to come between you and your form of contraception, of whether you even use contraception or not. That's a contradiction. Why do we have to constantly fight these battles again? Now let me talk to the African Americans and historians in the group right now. Do you know that after the Civil War, all over the South, there were black senators and black congressmen and sheriffs and justices of the peace, maybe governors and so forth, all over the South. And people in the South said, we can never go back to the point where black people don't vote and participate in the political situation, the political structure. And do you know how long it took in Reconstruction for resegregation of the ballot box in the South? By the end of the 1800s, by the beginning of the last century, the 20th century, black voting was wiped out. Black office holders were wiped out in the South. When I grew up in the South, it was called the Solid South. And I'll ask you students, was it solid? Did that mean it was solid Democrat or solid Republican? Solid Democrat. Everybody in the South was basically a Democrat. Why? Because Lincoln had freed the slaves. And we're still fighting the Civil War. When I grew up in the South, we're still fighting the Civil War. Lincoln was that doggone president that did away with slavery. Now, there's only one Democrat left on the congressional delegation from my state of Alabama. One. All the rest of them are Republican. Why is that? Well, the party of Lincoln has now become the party of safety for white people who are afraid of affirmative action and black people voting and immigrants coming to this country and women having rights and so forth. So there's been a total switchover. So don't say anything about that can't happen again. I wouldn't be surprised if the next thing they come up with is let's segregate the lunch counters again. Let's segregate the buses again. If you can reopen the question of contraception and all these other things that were supposed to have been solved, let's reopen those other things. And if we can do that, let's just go right on back to slavery. We can't do that. You know we can't do that. But what they can do is, by dividing people, they can still have power. And, you know, let me ask you something. As a reasonable human being, why would anybody who is a decent person, Democrat, Republican, Christian, Muslim, a Jew, anybody who is a decent person, why would you want to support people who already have more money and power than they know what to do with? Why would you be on their side? Why are you not normally and naturally, and I think I'm preaching to the choir because the good people are here tonight. I believe so. You have to take up for the people who need help. The other people don't need help. Do you know that we talked about the 1% and the 99%? Occupy America. Put economics and poverty back on the front burner. Our president wasn't talking about that. Nobody else. But when the young people went and they got their tents and their sleeping bags in New York, it spread all over the country. Now we're getting so finely tuned, we say it's not the 1% and the 99%, it's the 0.1% and the 99.9%. Because a very few people in this country hold most of the wealth. And I'll give you just one small example. At Walmart, the big store all over the country, from Arkansas. Arkansas has the lowest minimum wage in the United States, about $6.25. It may have gone up a dime or so, but somewhere around in there. Most countries in the world gauge the difference between the rich and the poor by how many more times the boss makes than the average worker. And in most countries, it might be that the boss makes 20 times what the average worker makes, or 25 times, sometimes rarely, maybe 30 times what an average worker makes. Do you know what it is in our country? Some of you economic students, I imagine you might know. 400 times the boss makes 400 times the average wage of the worker. Walmart, which I mentioned, the workers make $6.25 an hour. Do you know that the CEO of Walmart makes $16,000 each hour? $16,000 for $6.25. That is a level of inequality that democracy cannot stand. So what you're facing now in this Dorothy L. Thompson lecture series is whether or not we are going to fight for the rights of the 99% and stop having the tail wag the dog. It is unconscionable that we have gotten to this point. And I'll end with this by saying, because our rights were under attack by fundamentalists, we gave up our right to habeas corpus, pre-law. How many people are lawyers or pre-law or whatever? Just give me an idea. Okay, not very many. You know why they bury lawyers 12 feet deep rather than 6 feet deep? Because down deep they're good. I don't know why I slipped it. Please forgive me for that one. The point I'm really trying to make is that Americans are very strange. We fight for our rights fiercely. But do you know that when the buildings fell in 2001, we gave up the right to habeas corpus? Now anybody in here who is declared an enemy combatant or terrorist can be arrested, and you're not allowed to make a phone call. You're not allowed to be confronted by the evidence or by any witnesses against you. You're not allowed to be represented by counsel. You're not even allowed to contact your family. That's a basic right that Americans have always had. Even though it was violated at various times during wartime, we have now ensconced it in our law under the Patriot Act. And so it may be, you remember the firemen and the policemen and the emergency workers and so forth that ran into those burning buildings in New York as other people were fleeing? Those are working class heroes who fled into those, who rushed into those buildings to help and to save lives. Well, you may have to do just as dangerous a work in protecting and regaining our civil liberties in this country. Now, I'll end with this. When I finished college, and I did graduate, I was the only one of the Huntington Five that graduated in 1961 from Huntington, I joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And during my work with SNCC, in the first 36 months of my work with SNCC, 5 of my colleagues were murdered by racists in the South. They were lynched. They were killed. So unless you're going to go into the military, unless you're going to go into police work or something, you probably are going to go into a work where you wouldn't expect 5 of your colleagues to be murdered in the first 3 years of your work there. That's what it was like to win the rights that we won in the 60s. And out of that civil rights movement came a renewed, refreshed women's movement that went on to win victories. The gay, lesbian, bi, and transsexual revolution and freedom struggle came out of that. Brown power, Latino power, all of those things were reinvigorated or sprung right out of the civil rights movement. We're now on the brink now of having a new movement in this country to regain our rights, to have a redress of the terribly skewed politics. Can you imagine a major American party? And I don't pretend to be nonpartisan because I've been a civil rights worker all my life, which means that basically I've been a Democrat. I have voted for Republicans and I have great respect for Republicans. But that party, along with the rest of the country, has been pulled so far over to the right, has become so ultra that it's plausible to call President Obama a socialist. He's right in the middle of the spectrum, but the politics had been pulled so far over there that it seems like a centrist is now quite a radical person. It's not true. We have to redress the kind of political realignment that has occurred over the last 20 years and come back to some sort of parity. And I'll end with this. This summer, we hope to have another Freedom Summer. In Freedom Summer 1964, thousands of students came from all over the country to Mississippi. The response of the Mississippi Ku Klux Klan was to catch the first 3 students who crossed into Mississippi. They captured them, put them in jail, took them out of the jail that night at 10 o'clock, and murdered each one of them, shot and killed them. 2 white men from New York and a young black man from Mississippi, They died because they were going to Mississippi to do what? Help black people get the right to vote in 1964. One of the most basic rights that Americans have. You could be killed, you could get killed helping black people register to vote just in 64, just that few years ago. We have to go back to that kind of dedication. So what are you passionate about? What are you willing to take a risk for? Are you coming out of school with huge debt? I graduated college with what I thought was a huge debt in 1961. I owed almost $800. And now I can't imagine what, my daughter, my oldest daughter, probably owes thousands of dollars. She's just gotten her PhD in psychology. She has to work now for years just to pay that off. So we have a lot of work to do. But you know, I learned one thing from Mrs. Rosa Parks and from Dr. King. And it's important to remember this at the end of Black History Month and in Women's History Month this month of March. What they taught me was that brotherhood and sisterhood is not so wild a dream as those who profit by postponing it pretend it is. Thank you. Do we have a roaming mic? Do we have a roaming mic?
I think the idea is that when they come in the cards, then I can
Oh, good. Okay. Sorry.
So Mr. Zellner has kept his remarks a little bit short because he really wants to have questions from the audience, and I'm sure he'd welcome questions either about his own experiences in the civil rights movement or about some of the contemporary issues of freedom and in society today. So again, he'd like a wide-ranging discussion, and he'd be happy to engage those questions. It's my understanding that we have question cards that have gone around with the program. If we want to take a minute to fill those out with questions, we'll then collect those, and I'll read them from the mic here so that they get recorded with Mr. Zellner's responses.
And while that's happening, if it's okay, we can be informal enough for people to ask questions while you're writing those down?
Sure. And one other, I should have mentioned this at the outset, we also have copies of The Wrong Side of Murder Creek available for purchase afterwards in the foyer to Forum Hall, and we'll also have some cookies and coffees there to enjoy. Does anyone need then a card for a question for Mr. Zellner?
I forgot to get instructions on this. Do you know where the...
Here comes our technician right now.
Thank goodness for techies. Let's hear it from tech people. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Okay, good. What's the question?
We're waiting on number one.
Number one. Did somebody raise their hand? We don't have to be... So, yes.
What do you think of Ron Paul as a presidential candidate?
What do I think of Ron Paul as a presidential candidate? I like Ron Paul. I like Ron Paul very much. I like some of his libertarian ideas. I especially like the fact that he's one of the few who are upfront enough and brave enough to talk about our predilection to go to war, you know. And President Obama was speaking today on television. He said people who speak about going to war casually, especially Brother Romney, Romney said we need to be ready. We need to talk threateningly, and we need to be ready to go to war at the drop of a hat. So Ron Paul and the president says it's not a casual thing about war. And we cannot afford any longer, I think, to be the policeman of the world. So I like that part of Ron Paul's belief. I like some of his libertarian ideas. And I love the fact that they're incredible contradictions. Now, here's a person who's running for the nomination for the Republican nomination for president. He talks against the war. And most of the other candidates want to seem like they just, there's nothing better than war. They'd never heard of a war that they didn't like. And they'd, love to have one waiting in the wings because we had two going. We got Iraq done. Now we're in Afghanistan. And just about everybody believes we should just get out of there now. Does anybody know why we're still there? So I like Ron Paul on that very much. So there's another audible. Somebody would like to call an audible while we're collecting those questions? It doesn't have to be a question. You can make a statement. Yes, sir.
Well, in Kansas today, we're pushing for voter identification. We've got requirements that fortunately aren't going to get in place until the next election, that you got to have photo IDs, and there are a heck of a lot of folks, particularly elderly people and particularly poor people, who don't have the requisite birth certificates or can't lay their hands on them easily. Is this one of the places maintaining the right to vote for everybody that you'd encourage students today to be involved with?
Good question. Voting should be made easier, not more difficult. And nobody had ever noticed the huge amount of voter fraud and so forth in this country. We probably have one of the most fraud-free voting systems in the world. We always hear stories about them. Now we have attorneys general and others who are looking as hard as they possibly can, and they can barely scrape up a few cases of voter fraud. So it's not about voter fraud. Clearly it is a shuck and a jive, and it's an effort to cut down the franchise, to lower the vote. And when you have those strictnesses, you're attacking Latinos, you're attacking poor people in general, African Americans, a whole group of people who are more likely to vote Democrat than they are Republican. So in many cases, and I hate to be, this is Super Tuesday today. Is everybody watching? There's a huge, Republican primary on, so I have to talk about that. That is one of the worst things that has been attempted by this ultra-extreme right wing. And they want to restrict it. You've had people like the Cole brothers and Pope and so forth. That's one of the reasons we're having Freedom Summer in North Carolina this year, because they have made a huge push to lower the vote in North Carolina. We should make it easier, not more difficult. Yes?
In this state, or in this city, if a student wants to get involved, they should talk to that socialist organization, the League of Women Voters.
The League of Women Voters, that dangerous communist outfit, the League of Women Voters, and they're very definitely nonpartisan, bipartisan, and they do get a lot done on voter registration. And we should all be members, whether you're a woman or not. Yes. One more.
Have you ever thought about running for office or something?
My friend from Saudi Arabia. Yes, I have thought of running. In fact, I have run, and I hope that you're thinking of running, maybe back home in Saudi Arabia. We had an earlier discussion today, and somehow or another I spotted my friend as a politician right away, and he said he was from Saudi Arabia, and I said, let's talk politics. And he said, great, okay. I have run for office, but I've usually run for office as an organizer, as a way to try to bring issues up and so forth. And that is a very good way to run for office. And hopefully some people will actually win and be in those offices. One of the things the Tea Party has done is that they have used the democratic process extremely well. They've done a lot of grassroots organizing, and with lots and lots of money, they have gone in way ahead of time. And in North Carolina, they focused on what? School boards. And I'll tell you just one thing about what they did in the political structure there. The Koch brothers put in a huge amount of money to influence school boards, because school boards were generally rather progressive. They wanted to have good schools. In the triangle cities in North Carolina, Durham, Raleigh, and Chapel Hill, they had the best school system in the United States in terms of diversity, performance, and everything else. When the Republicans took over the legislature, they overstepped seriously, because they began to change those school boards drastically. And it was the real estate industry, of all people, who came to the Republican legislature and said, don't fool with the schools in the Tri-Cities, because people are moving here and our property values are very high because we have the best school system in the United States. And it's not to be destroyed, because their aim was to undiversify the school, to resegregate the school system. So, yes, running for office is very good, and I recommend everybody to do it as a way of letting your views be known and to educate people.
So we have several questions that are more historical in nature, and then some that are more contemporary issues. Let's take a couple of the.
All right, let's shoot and see what we can do with them.
Okay.
Also, I hope you'll give your opinion as well. I always say it's usually question and answer, but if you have an opinion, please let me know that too. One of the best things we had during our student meetings today is some give and take between Republicans and Democrats and so forth. So we had really good give and take.
So in your work with SNCC, is there a specific moment or event that stands out to you? And then to pair that with a related question, was there a moment or event where you feel like you witnessed change? And are there ways that those changes continue into the present day?
Okay, very good. And everybody heard that. Good. I witnessed a specific change in the civil rights movement very early on, because when I grew up in Alabama in the 40s and the 50s, do you know what generations get names and so forth? Do you know what our generation was called? Our generation was called the silent generation. How would you like to be known as the silent generation? I don't know what the current one is. There was an X generation and so forth. But we were known as the silent generation. The reason that silent generation became the civil rights generation was that the young black people of the South took freedom in their very hands. And on February the 1st, and everybody who is a historian of the civil rights movement has to know the importance of the date February 1st, 1960. A lot of things were coming together at that time, but the main thing that happened is that 4 freshmen in Greensboro, North Carolina, after a bull session in their dorm room, said, we can go downtown and at the Woolworths we can buy something at every counter except the lunch counter. And this town depends to a large extent on its black and white students. So we're going to go down and we're, for the first time, going to get a hamburger and a cup of coffee at the lunch counter. So that's what they did. And that was a change to me, because here I was in college, and I was in sociology courses where I was told by my professor if I went out to do research, I could be arrested. And here these students went, and boy, I remember they were really well dressed. They weren't hippies or anything. They had trench coats, they had their books with them. If you see pictures from them, they had those little narrow ties and everything. They were looking good. And they sat at those lunch counters and they said, I want a hamburger and a cup of coffee. And the waitress said, we don't serve in the N-word. And they said, well, we're not ordering the N-word, we're ordering coffee and hamburger. And when they said, well, you can't get served here, they said, we'll wait. And they sat at those lunch counters. And when they were finally arrested, the next morning, not 4, but 12 came. When they were arrested the next morning, not 24, but 44 came. And within 3 months, 60,000 students across the United States of the Confederacy, across the South, and now they're beginning to have sympathy sit-ins and pickets in the North, supporting the lunch counter sit-ins. It swept my region. That was what was really exciting to me, to see students my age taking a risk. And do you know, I have learned since that these black students who started and the few white allies that they had, many times they were the first of their family to ever go to college or university. And their families were dismayed that they were going to go to jail. You're going to have a police record now. So it was the beginning of breaking down the fear of the law. Always in the South, the law had meant the petty rollers, the Ku Klux Klan, the vigilantes, the police state of the police that served to maintain segregation. They were challenging that. So that's one thing I remember that had a huge effect on me. So that when I graduated college, I said, those are the people I want to work with.
Dr. King was hesitant about SNCC and the Freedom Riders. Perhaps he feared that the young idealism was not a smart strategy because people could get killed, and that could be detrimental. What's your thought on these differences about strategy?
There were always differences in strategy of the different organizations. Dr. King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was mainly a little bit older. Dr. King was almost 10 years older than me. So when I was 19 and I met Dr. King and he was already 29, he seemed to be much, much older. Later on, when we were in jail together in Albany, Georgia, many years later, it would seem more the same age. But they... tell me the question again. I get these riffs and I forget.
That the idealism and strategy of SNCC and the Freedom Riders.
If that was, difference in strategies. Yeah. Okay. Well, it was normal that the students, since we didn't have wives, we didn't have children, we didn't have jobs, and so forth, the students could be much more militant than people who were older, who had professions, who had children, and so forth. So it was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that went to the roughest places. SNCC, we call it SNCC for short. SNCC believed if somebody said, you can't do civil rights work in Macomb, Mississippi, we said, that's where we're going. They said, you can't do civil rights work in the Delta, Mississippi. That's where we're going. The Klan is too strong, so-and-so. That's where we're going. So that was one of the differences in strategy. But the SCLC was generally church-based, minister-based, and so forth. SNCC was student-based and local people like Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer and other. There were many geniuses in the South who had never had an opportunity to show their leadership ability. Fannie Lou Hamer worked on a sharecropper farm on James Eastland's plantation in the Delta, Mississippi. And when SNCC came along, she said, I've been waiting for this my whole life. And she became one of the great, great leaders of the civil rights movement. So that was our different role. The NAACP was also older, and they had a legal strategy. They would have cases, and they would carry them through, and they did great, great work. By the way, the NAACP was the original civil rights organization, formed in 1909. I'm a member of the NAACP. I work very closely with the NAACP. And everybody who is concerned about civil rights, human rights, and so forth, Latinos, women, everybody should be a member of the NAACP now. I'm asking you to be a member of the NAACP. If you're not really serious about social change. It was the original civil rights organization, and it's the one that's most functional and operational today. And there is a fight inside I wouldn't call it a fight, there's a struggle inside the NAACP now between the Honor Society part of the NAACP, which they do very well, and the organizing side. I'm working with Reverend Barber, Julian Bond, Benjamin Jealous, the young president of the NAACP, and so forth, Mrs. Brock, the new chairperson of the board. We are working now to get a balance in the NAACP between the Honor Society role and the organizing role. That's why we're doing the Freedom Summer next summer in the South. I forgot what the question was, but I hope I touched on it a little bit.
Well, if I could
The different strategies, yes.
If I could push it just a little more, I'm just curious.
Okay.
So within these different organizations, was there communication and debates about those strategies?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And kind of what form would that take? And
Well, I can give you an example. SNCC had a major influence on Robert Kennedy, for instance. SNCC were the young people, the shock troops, and so forth. Robert Kennedy was the very young Attorney General of his brother, the President John Kennedy, JFK. And the SNCC struggled with Bob E. Kennedy to bring him into sync with the civil rights organizations. We also struggled with Dr. King. We sometimes, not disrespectfully, but certainly irreverently, referred to Dr. King as the Lord. You know, the Lord has said, the Lord has done. So we were young people and brash and so forth. And here we are calling now one of the American icons the Lord. Well, at the time of the freedom rides, those rides were met with such violence. You know, in Alabama, they burned the bus, and it was on the front page of every newspaper in the world. They tried to block the doors of the bus. They tried to burn up the people in the bus. They tried to kill a busload of people. So Dr. King and other people were concerned people are going to lose their lives. Now, what SNCC told Dr. King was, we have written our wills. We know that we may die. You didn't do what SNCC did if you cared more about living than you did about the cause. So we had what Dr. King called later on. We had something we were willing to die for. So that was a little different from the older people in SCLC. They couldn't quite see it because the people who finally fought their way through my state of Alabama, the bus was burned in Anniston. When the other bus got to Birmingham, Bull Connor let the Klan massacre those Freedom Riders, beat them horribly. Some never recovered from their injuries. Then, even after the troops were going to help, and they were supposed to have protection, when they went into Montgomery, once again, all of the protection pulled away. Not a single policeman was there, and the Ku Klux Klan had 15 to 20 minutes to massacre those Freedom Riders again. So by the time they got on that final bus to go to Mississippi, every Freedom Rider thought that when they got to Mississippi, they would certainly be killed. If that happened to them in Alabama, they were going to be killed in Mississippi. So you didn't work with SNCC if you were primarily concerned about living a long life. We took a risk. We put our lives on the line, and many people gave their lives for those. So if you're a student now, whatever it takes, get registered to vote, and please vote. Doesn't matter how you vote. We need citizen participation. If you're a young Republican, a Republican activist and so forth, you need to do that. I believe there's a fight inside the Republican Party for the soul of the Republican Party. And it has to be won on the progressive side, or that party is going to go away. That party will die. It was once the party of Lincoln. It has now gotten so ridiculous that Rush Limbaugh is supposed to be the voice of the Republicans. Everybody should be totally disgusted with what he did just recently on radio and television. And it's having an effect. He even apologized. I don't think he's ever apologized before.
One last question related to this historical period before we come to some of these more contemporary questions. In your experiences as an activist, did you feel that it was more painful in terms of emotional pain of being part of this movement, or the physical pain and fear of actual violence against yourself, your own body, and others around you?
Well, we didn't focus on the fear, and we didn't focus on the pain. And people ask, weren't you afraid? When I was writing my memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, my editor kept saying, weren't you afraid? And I said, of course I was afraid. I was scared to death. Well, it doesn't read like you were afraid. I said, well, it goes without saying that you're afraid. If you go to do from here to go do that, and you know there's a good chance you could be killed, of course you're afraid. It's a human response. If you weren't afraid, you'd be insane. So I'll tell you my first meeting of SNCC, and just to give you an idea of what it was like. And I never worried about a thing after my first SNCC meeting. I joined the staff on September the 11th, 1961, as the first white Southerner to be a field secretary for SNCC. I joined it because it was the most militant, most significant civil rights organization. Right after I joined, Herbert Lee, who was working with Bob Moses in Mississippi on voter registration, trying to get black people registered to vote, a fully American activity. Herbert Lee was murdered by his next-door neighbor because he went down to register to vote. Herbert Lee was black, his next-door neighbor was white. His neighbor was a member of the Mississippi State Legislature. Walked up to Herbert Lee after he had attempted to vote and shot him in the head, killing him. E.H. Hurst, the killer, was never tried, never had any trials, living still today. He's killed Herbert Lee, the father of 14 kids, leaving a wife and 14 kids. And that's where we went for our first meeting, to Macomb, Mississippi. So I said, boy, this is the organization that I've been wanting to get into, and here they're going to go where the guy was killed. The other organizations, not criticizing, they'd have their meetings in Atlanta, New Orleans, Charleston, Charlotte, other places. We went to Macomb, Mississippi, my first meeting of SNCC. While there, 130 students from the Berglund High School, all black, walked out of school, and we were going to go down and protest the murder of Herbert Lee and the fact that some of their students had been expelled from the high school for participating in a sit-in. That was my first action because, first of all, I said to myself, well, I can't go because my job was to go to white Southern campuses in the South and explain what's happening in the civil rights movement. And I said, if I go on this march, I'll be arrested. I'll never get on any white campus. I said, plus my daddy will lose his church, my mother will lose her teaching job, and there'd be more violence than usual. And then I realized I was talking to myself because nobody was telling me to go on the march or not. And then I realized that's what happened with SNCC. If it was a life and death situation, nobody said you should go, or you were supposed to go, or whatever. You made up your own mind. So as those students filed out, I fell right in line with them. Only white person in the group of 130 or 40 students and staff members of SNCC. To make a long story short, when we got to the town hall, there was a huge mob there. The police began to arrest the students one by one. The mob surrounded me and began to hit me. And they would hit me, and then they would look at the police. And the police would say, with all their body language and everything, yeah, get that guy. That's a white guy. He's with the black students and so forth. Get him, and get him good. So they began to beat me pretty severely. As they did, Bob Moses and Chuck McDew, both black staff members of SNCC, came over to stand between me and the people who were hitting me. The police then were enraged that the black men trying to protect me. So the police came over and hit them with their nightsticks. And if you've ever seen a nightstick hit a skull, as hard as you would take a baseball bat and hit this podium, full strength, to see a piece of wood hit a skull and see it split and see the white bone of the skull showing through, and then a slow trickle of blood, and then a swelling that you could see, a swelling that was right in front of you. And I remember thinking, what are these people going to do when they get us in their jail? I knew we were all, if we survived the beating, we would be in jail. If they beat you in front of people like this and the press and everything else, what are they going to do when they get us in jail? Well, then they dragged them away from me after beating them, and they left me with the mob. I had a Bible in my hand because somebody had handed me a Bible. The big mob in the street with baseball bats and pipes and so forth kept screaming, "Bring him here, we'll kill him, bring him here." So I knew that if they were able to get me off of those city hall steps out into that street, no power on earth would keep that mob from beating me to death. They were bound and determined they were going to beat me to death. So I was new to nonviolence, so I put the Bible down. I remember hearing my father in his best preaching voice, and the voice said, "God helps those who help themselves." So I placed the Bible on the ground and took hold of the railing down the steps of the city hall. That enraged them further now because I'm resisting. I'm resisting now. And luckily, you know, when I was in college, I was a martial arts instructor. So I was in shape. I was in shape. And not only was a martial arts instructor, but I don't usually tell audiences this, but I was the first dancer of the Montgomery, Alabama Civic Ballet. So any of you athletes, you want to be in shape, take ballet. That's the best exercise you can possibly do. So I was in shape. So I was ready for this fight, you know. And I was highly motivated to hold on, right? And I remember thinking, you know, these distracted thoughts. I kept thinking, these people are overreacting. It was my first demonstration. I said, and next thing I thought, well, this is the shortest civil rights career in history. I think it killed me on my first day. So they would pull, and when they came back to get another grip, I would actually move up the rail because they were hitting my hands with pipes and so forth. There was blood all over the rail, blood all over me. As I worked my way to the top of the steps, they could not believe that 12 or 15 men, they had my belt, they tore all my clothes off. I held on to this railing, and I would move up the rail. And they were so frustrated then that one person came over the back of my head with his fingers, and he started putting his fingers into my eye socket. And then the sociologist in me came out, and I said, oh, this is eye gouging. This is mayhem. I've read about this, the honor system in the South. You know, if somebody violates the mores, you have to kill them or put their eyes out or something. So I remember that my martial arts training came in handy because I was paying attention to the pulling and the beating of my hands, and it's still the same. I couldn't let go to protect my eye. So every time he almost got it between his thumb and forefinger, I would move my head and my eyeball would thunk back into my eye socket. And to this day, I go to college campuses and professors will say, tell the eye story. My students are fascinated with the eye story. I think the reason is that I try to bring you as close as possible to inside the mob. And what were we doing? We were protesting the murder of a black farmer who wanted to register to vote. We were working with high school students who were helping other farmers to register to vote. A most American thing. So anyway, I won't tell you the rest of the story. It's in the book. So, and I will mention that The Wrong Side of Murder Creek is being made into a major motion picture by Spike Lee, and they're waiting for. They've gotten Jake Gyllenhaal. Do people know movie stars? They say that Jake Gyllenhaal is a big movie star. Judi Dench and Don Cheadle and several others. So Spike is putting together a major cast for making a movie out of my very humble book. So I wrote, yeah. Thank you.
So a couple comments perhaps on contemporary things.
Okay, but in the meantime, if there are any young budding actors or actresses or music people or want to be production assistants or assistant directors or whatever, get in touch with me. I'll give you my email and send your resume in, and you'll work on The Wrong Side. On the movie's called Son of the South. I think that's the working title of it. Yes.
Would you like to comment on the Arab Spring or this movement for freedom in Syria? Do you see those as extensions, international extensions of ideas you've struggled for?
Yes, and also we have a representative with us from Saudi Arabia who's working on. Would you stand, please? And can you give me your name again? Okay. All right. He's the North American representative who's representing. He's Saudi Arabian. He's representing the Syrian people. There's an event coming up, I think, on Saturday of support. What's the date and place? Thursday. Okay. And what's the time and place? 10 o'clock to 3 at the Union. So everybody should be concerned about that. It's one of the great humanitarian tragedies of all time that this dictator in Syria is brutalizing his own people to the extent that is, and the rest, most of the world is paralyzed while we're watching it, but whatever little bit we can do. The Arab Spring was a tremendous reawakening, not only of the yearning for democracy and freedom in North Africa, in the Middle East, but it re-inspired our movement. And the Occupy movement, I think, came directly out of that. One of the things that went before all that, I think, was the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides. In Chicago, many of us, 200 and something former Freedom Riders, were on the Oprah show. And one of the things that we talked about was Occupy. And we released a statement, and I can send that to you. It's before Occupy, before Arab Spring. Well, no, it probably was after the Arab Spring had begun. But we laid out a program that was followed almost exactly by the Occupy movement. So, yes, tremendous amount of energy and dedication is coming from the young people, and it's putting generations back together. And it's saying to our country, I am willing to take a risk for something I believe in. So we're supporting the Arab Spring as much as possible. We're also, Wisconsin was a tremendous inspiration to the Occupy movement. Ohio, where working people once again are defending their rights. In Wisconsin, it was terrible because the teachers had one thin layer of protection left. And usually when the ultra-right takes over, they overstep their bounds. So what they did, Governor, what's his name? Walker won by a very small margin, but then he comes in and oversteps by trying to end collective bargaining for teachers and therefore other unions and so forth. So the union movement, the students and so forth rose up, and the rest is history. We're in the process of a new movement in this United States, and I'm very excited about it. It's a good time to be alive, and I'm glad you're all going to be fighting in that movement.
So maybe we will.
One more?
Last question here. And
Good.
Then we'll turn to your,
last question.
To your book signing. And again,
yes.
We invite everyone to stay for some
refreshments
Reverend?
And
for...
Would you do it again?
Oh, would I do it again? Absolutely. I was so privileged to have been a participant in that. When I tell my university students that I knew Eleanor Roosevelt, and I worked with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, some of them say, "Did you meet Harriet Tubman? Did you know Abraham Lincoln?" So I said, well, that was the same movement, but they were in there even earlier than me. And what's the...
In your comments tonight, you've mentioned that elected officials, that they considered everyone in the civil rights movement a communist. But in your comments, you've often called people who don't agree with your political views the S word, segregationists.
Yes.
Isn't that the same tactic?
It probably is the same tactic, and it's part of political discourse to name and define your opponent. But there certainly were communists involved in the civil rights movement. I mean, and there certainly are segregationists and racists involved in the ultra-right-wing movement. So it doesn't mean that just because you blanketly state. But the question has a good base, a good root, and that is, can't we disagree with civility? And I definitely agree with the sentiment there. We learned very early on that McCarthyism had been used in this country. McCarthy, if you don't know about McCarthy, he was from Wisconsin. He wasn't a Southerner at all. And he learned that he could amass immense power simply by waving a list and say, I have a list of 180 people or whatever in the State Department who were communists. So one of the things that they did with us in the movement was having everybody question each other's patriotism or American, loyalty to America. So what we said in the movement was, we don't care what you believe. If you're going to work with us, you're going to put your life on the line. So we don't care if you're a communist, we don't care if you're a Klansman, whatever your belief is, if you're working in the same direction that we are, okay. And today, I don't care how racist you are, how much of segregationist you are, it's the behavior that I'm concerned about. So the only thing I would do in this debate, and we now once again have the debate in this country between the right and the left, I would say, look at the great people in your party, in your movement, and what is their record? What is their activity in favor of black and white together? What is their activity? What is their record of bringing people together and embracing diversity and difference? Because that's what our country is based on. Our country had people coming from all directions. You know what the Shinnecocks in Southampton said when the first white people came? White people came down from Massachusetts, got off the boat, and headed up toward the Native Americans, and the Indians looked and said, oh, there goes the neighborhood. These undocumented immigrants are coming, invading Long Island. This is our island. So the first undocumented immigrants in this country were white settlers that came to Indian country. So we have to have a way of communicating with each other. So if I unfairly label someone a racist or a segregationist, I apologize for that. But do you know who was the greatest defender of black people in this country? A Republican. Abraham Lincoln, who was the greatest organizer there ever was. He started out to save the Union, and you know what he said in the beginning? I will save the Union if it means preserving slavery. I will save the Union if it means abolishing slavery. I don't care. I'm saving the Union. Do you know that he was not successful in saving the Union, however, until Lincoln and the rest of the country made it a moral imperative that slavery be ended. Slavery was, in the beginning, might have been a minor part of things. He said, I'll save the Union if it means preserving slavery, or I'll save it if it means abolishing slavery. At the end, he said, this is the great crusade of America to end slavery. So one of the greatest persons against racism and slavery in this country was a Republican, Abraham Lincoln. I give him honor. Thank you. I'm going to go sign now. I'm done. Okay. Thank you.
So again, we invite all of you to join us for refreshments in the foyer, and we have copies of Mr. Zellner's memoir for sale, and he'd be happy to continue speaking with you and signing those copies.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
I'll be out here. Oh, thank you.